History of Canada was fun. I really enjoyed making and researching about those videos, and if you haven't seen them, I think that you should because they're very good and I put a lot of work into them. But now this week, it's time for something different, something that really changed the entire world. Like I've talked about it in previous videos, but now it's time to go in deep. I assume that most of you read books, or at least have seen a book somewhere at some point in your life. I'm actually just kidding. I know most of you are smart people and that you all read books, but I'm also going to assume that you know that books haven't always been as accessible as we have them today. Like there was a time where books had to be copied by hand, but today they aren't. Our technology has gotten to a point where we can really print books very easily and have them accessible to pretty much anybody. Like anybody who wants to read a book can just go to the library and get a book and just read it. But how exactly did we get there? How did we get from manual copying to mechanical printing? Well, that's exactly what we're going to talk about today. Welcome to Fox of Knowledge. This week's topic is very hard to pronounce. It's about the Gutenberg Printing Press, the invention that really changed the way that information was being distributed. It was because of that the middle class finally got access to books, something that had never been seen before. But as always, let's put all of this in historical context and get some background. If you go way back, for example in the Roman Empire, you'll find that they had no books. And I'm not just talking about the low and the middle class, I'm talking about everybody. Nobody had books because books in our current form did not exist. Instead, all their writings were made in scrolls. You may have heard about ancient scrolls, and if you study history, then you know that anything beyond the year 500 was written on a scroll. Books were not invented, they only came after that. And in fact, it wasn't even called a book, it was called a codex. And honestly, that's like such a better name than book, like, I think I'm gonna use that. The switch from scrolls to codexes may seem like something insignificant, but actually it had a lot of benefits. For example, it was much easier to read on a book than on a scroll. Just think of a scroll. Like a scroll is very big. You have to like unravel it in different ways to just read everything. A book, you just have to turn a page. It's very easy. And since a book, you turn pages, you can write on both sides of the page, something that you can't necessarily do with a scroll. But to have a proper codex or a proper book, you also need quality paper, and luckily paper in the 13th century was actually being improved and the price was going down dramatically, which meant that paper was like accessible to anybody that wanted to make use of it. Add on to that the fact that in the late Middle Ages, people were kind of changing. They were becoming curious about things, they wanted to know more, they wanted to learn more, and they wanted to just become smarter. And unfortunately, the only way that you could do that was through books, and manually copying a book, well, that wasn't going to cut it. So why am I talking about all of these things? Well, it's because of these things that we can kind of get an idea that in the late Middle Ages, people wanted a change, and they were also ready for a change. They were expecting a change. They had all the ingredients necessary for a sort of intellectual revolution to take place. All that was needed was something or someone to do something about it. And that brings us to our topic of the week, the Gutenberg Printing Press. Simply put, it was a printing machine developed by an inventor called Johannes Gutenberg, who was able to really accelerate the way that books were being spread out in the world. And he was also the first one to really print a book mechanically. Gutenberg was a German goldsmith who lived in the 15th century and is credited for having created the printing press, and really revolutionizing the way that information was going to be distributed from then on. He mixed existing technologies with his own inventions to create the very first printing press. He began his work on the printing press in 1436, but actually we don't have any records that prove it, like nothing survives from that time. The only record, the earliest record that we have of him and the printing press, comes a few years later in 1439 when he was sued by one of his investors. He had this idea to use existing technologies to tweak them a little bit and try to come up with a way that you could print text on a piece of paper. He inspired himself from multiple things, one of them being something called a screw press, which was very similar in technology but was used for grapes to make wine. Since wine had kind of always been part of the usual diet throughout the ages, well, that technology was already very old by the time that Gutenberg was alive. He adopted the basic design, he made a few changes, like the way the pressure was being applied, and really made that into something that could be used as a printing press. The next problem was that of the letters. How exactly was he going to find an efficient way to, first of all, make letters, and then be able to rearrange them any way he wanted to make any kind of word that he wanted? Like, this is a lot harder than you might think, and previous cultures had already tried, like the Chinese for example, but they all failed. The Chinese were already doing something similar. They would carve wooden blocks with the right word on it, they would apply some water-based ink, and then they would apply the pressure to a piece of paper, and it would result in a word on a piece of paper. The only problem was that if you wanted to change your word, you had to get a completely new block of wood, like there was no way to just reuse that. Gutenberg used that as inspiration, and that was arguably the best that he could do. Like, even if he was to use the wooden blocks the same way that the Chinese were using them, they would not work, they would just break under the pressure. Like, he had to find something a little bit stronger. Being a goldsmith, he had a lot of knowledge about metals, and that allowed him to create perhaps his best invention yet, a lead-based alloy that would have the right properties to be used on his printing press. If you've seen my Iron Age video, then you'll know exactly what an alloy is. For those that don't know, an alloy is simply taking a metal, melting it, and then mixing it with something else to produce a slightly different variation of that same metal. That way you can play around with the properties and really make something that's going to suit exactly what you need. Gutenberg found the perfect mix of metals to make his type. Now, what is a type? A type is simply the physical equivalent of a font that you would have on your computer. Like if you open up any font on your computer, you will see that you have a design for each letter. Well, a type is the same thing, but like physically, you have a physical design for each letter. This had two very big benefits. For one, well, if you took the letters, you could really make any word that you wanted. Like there was no limits, right? As long as you had the letters for it, you could make the word for it. Something that you couldn't really do with the wooden block version, right? And second, well, his alloy was so good and so strong that it was actually very durable, so the letters could be used over and over again. Not only was it very convenient, but it was also very cheap. And Gutenberg, he also used the Latin language, which allowed him to make any word with like 24 characters. Like that's all he needed, right? He used a little to make a lot. Like that's actually very smart. Very smart. This might seem like it's not such a big deal, and honestly, to us living in the 21st century, it really isn't. But don't forget that there was a time where this did not exist. Like there was a time where books did not exist. Like Gutenberg was the first one to actually put all of the pieces together and really make the printing machine. Like that's remarkable. The last invention that Gutenberg was credited for was the ink that he was using for his machine. I mentioned earlier that the Chinese, on their wooden blocks, they were using water-based ink. In fact, everybody was using water-based ink. It was the best that they had. But Gutenberg, however, had a different idea. He found a way to create a different type of ink that was not based on water but was based on oil, and that allowed the ink to stick a lot better to his machine and also stick a lot better to paper. Like, once again, he found a way to greatly improve the printing process. It was so good that we still use it today. His first quest was to print the Bible, and he actually did it. He printed 200 copies of the Bible that are now called the Gutenberg Bibles, and out of those 200, only about 40 remain today. Gutenberg was like an interesting man. Like after developing the printing machine, the first thing that he goes and prints is like the Bible. That's really brave. Naturally, in the Middle Ages, if you're going to print the Bible in any other way than by hand, well, that's bound to make the news. Like that information is going to spread like wildfire, and boy did it spread. Like he tried to keep it a secret, but as soon as word got out that a Bible had been printed mechanically, like it was game over. Like I mentioned before, the world was ready for this. In fact, they were actually waiting for it. Like they wanted books, they wanted to read, they wanted to become smarter. And finally, there was a way that they could get access to those books. Like Europe, within the span of like a few decades, went up to printing billions of books. Like I'm not even exaggerating. Printing made it so easy and so efficient compared to manually copying a whole book. Like just think about the difference, right? From copying a whole book to having it printed page by page. Like the difference was huge. Instead of paying somebody to copy a whole book for you, which by the way would take ages, like just think of the Bible, for example. The Bible is like huge. Like it would take ages to copy that whole book. You could just buy a printing machine or like buy 5 of them, have people work them, and just print the Bible page by page. Like the amount of work to the amount of Bible produced, like that ratio is huge. For the first time ever, the middle class had access to books, just like they wanted. Information spread like wildfire and everybody began reading. That's actually where we see a big spike in the average person's intellect after the invention of the printing press. It's very similar to what happened today with the internet. And since it was so cheap, it actually made sense to print newspapers now. You could, as a person living in the Middle Ages, go to your local market, buy a newspaper, and just inform yourself as to what's going on in the world or even just around you. It's why they call it the press, right? It comes from the printing press. The impact of the printing press is huge. Like it's too big to just talk about in one video. As we've seen, it affected the Enlightenment, the Scientific Revolution, the Renaissance, and so many more. Like just think of how much the internet has changed our lives. Like it changed everything. So I think we owe Gutenberg some appreciation. So now here are my questions to you. First of all, do you read books? Like have you heard about the printing press before? Or are you surprised about the impact that it had? I would love to know, so please leave me a comment because I really want this to be more than just a show. Like I want this to be a conversation. And bonus points for you, if you do leave a comment, you might get featured in next week's video as a fan of the week. As you know, and as I say at the end of every video, I haven't talked about everything, and the things that I did talk about, I haven't gone into too much detail. That's okay, that's actually done on purpose because I want you guys to go out and research on your own and maybe learn a thing or two. With that being said, my name has been Cosden. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I will see you all next Wednesday.